Morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Chip Korn, Pingree class of '89, and President of Alumni Association. Would like to welcome all of you to Career Day. Today, we're proud to welcome more than 50 alums back to campus, many of whom, I think about 40 of whom, this is the first Career Day that they're participating in. To the students, I encourage you to really engage in the sessions you're going to be attending. Take advantage of the day, introduce yourselves, ask questions. These are designed to be interactive, and the day is really all about you to get the most out of it that you possibly can. The Pingree Alumni Association, this is kind of maybe for some of you your first exposure to the Alumni Association. And we're an organization that you will be part of for the rest of your lives. There's I like the term, the long blue line of Pingree students in front of you and behind you that you'll be a part of and be able to lean on and network with throughout your lives. So after the keynote address, I'd just like to ask that all the students remain seated until the speakers are dismissed, and then the students can head off to the first session. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Headmaster Nat Connor to introduce our keynote. Thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many alumni back for this event, and it's just a tremendous opportunity for them, of course, as well, but for all of you juniors and seniors to talk to people who have been to the same school that you've been to, sat in many cases in the same classrooms, and actually in many cases also had the same teachers that you've had, and who are now out in the world. I talked to a few of the folks who were back, and one of the questions I asked was, when you were a student at Pingree, was your dream to do what you are currently doing professionally? And for most of them, the answer was no, and for some it was, what I'm doing professionally didn't exist as an option when I was a student at Pingree. So as you guys think about what's out there, and you think about your plans, whether those plans are firmly formed, you know exactly what you want to do every year of your life, or completely open, you have absolutely no clue, recognize that this is an opportunity to interact with alumni who have been there, who have made that journey, and who can perhaps ask you some questions or offer a few answers to some that you may have. So take full advantage of the day. Our keynote speaker today is award-winning writer Lyric Walworth-Winnick, class of 1984. She is a magna cum laude Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Princeton University who, in addition to her English degree from Princeton, also holds a master's in American history from Johns Hopkins University. Lyric has been called the go-to scribe for political memoirs by the New York Times after collaborating on 4 major best-selling biographies in less than 5 years. She has worked on books with First Lady Michelle Obama and former First Lady Laura Bush, and both of those projects debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Lyric has just finished a major new title for Scribner, We Are Afghan Women, Voices of Hope, that is scheduled for a March 8th release. Sheryl Sandberg, Facebook's chief operating officer and the founder of leanin.org, has described the book as, quote, an incredible portrait of the Afghan women working to create a better future for their communities and future generations. Their stories of strength and resilience can inspire us all to reach for a more equal and peaceful world, unquote. Lyric is currently finishing a memoir project for Simon & Schuster in which she tells the story of a Saudi Arabian woman who was arrested and jailed for driving. For more than a decade, Lyric was the Washington correspondent for Parade magazine. She has received the Simon Rockhour Prize for Excellence in Feature Writing from the American Jewish Press Association for a profile she wrote on Hans Munch, the last surviving Nazi doctor from Auschwitz, and she was a finalist for the coveted Livingston Prize given to the best young journalist in the nation. Her impressive lineup of profile and interview subjects includes some names you might recognize: Bill Gates, Hillary Clinton, Donald Rumsfeld, U2's Bono, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, Sir Richard Branson, Dick Cheney, and Jordan's Queen Noor. We are honored to have this accomplished Pingree graduate with us today as our keynote speaker. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lyric Walwork-Winnick. Lyric.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Headmaster Conrad, for that great introduction. Thank you all. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's nice to see all of you looking so awake. The last time I stood here on this stage, I was actually getting my diploma from Pingree. And because my last name started with W, I got to sit way in the back and be very anonymous. And standing up here all by my lonesome this morning, I'm thinking that was an excellent strategy. At Pingree, I was a very good student, but I wasn't the top student. Most people liked me, I think, but I wasn't by any stretch of the imagination one of the popular kids. I certainly wasn't cool. Back then, I was what used to be called outdoorsy, but I wasn't an athlete anyone was dying to have on her team. If you ask my classmates what they remembered about me, they'd probably say that I worked really hard and did a ridiculous number of extracurricular activities, starting with being editor-in-chief of the Pingree Record. If I had to describe myself, I'd say that I was actually kind of shy. I think the term of art now is socially awkward. I was never quite sure where to sit in the cafeteria or if anyone wanted to sit with me. So as a junior and a senior, I walked around with a cup of really awful tasting coffee and an apple. Except for having an unusual name, I might have been almost completely anonymous all through high school. In fact, when I first started writing for the Pingree Record, as a ninth grader, most of the sophomores, juniors, and seniors thought I was a figment of editor John Karp's imagination. I still remember him dragging me down a hallway, calling out, "See, she's real." All of which is a long way of saying that there was relatively little about me in high school to suggest that I would be standing up here in front of all of you today. So don't panic if you aren't at the top of anything right now or getting the coveted invites. Life still has a lot of surprises in store. I did leave Pingree with some very big gifts and advantages: my excellent education and exposure to excellent teachers. I'm forever grateful to the late Jack Dufford for teaching me perfect paragraph structure, to David Allen's American History, Jerry Keene's Econ 101, Mr. Moffat's English, Barbara Berlin's amazing and invaluable art history, and most of all, to the wonderful, generous, and wise Pat Leonetti, who's somewhere here today, who was my newspaper advisor and in-school mom and taught me 7th grade linguistics, and so many more. Way back when, we actually didn't even have Career Day at Pingree. But if we had, and someone had advertised a panel with a former magazine writer turned book collaborator, AKA ghostwriter, I'm not sure I would have said, "Yes, excellent, that's it, that's my future career path, sign me up." It would be easy to tell you, smugly, that I always knew exactly what I was going to do, that I had it mapped all out and simply executed the plan. In fact, some really big things in my career have been complete accidents. I almost went to law school, as in I applied to law school, I was accepted, and only at the very last minute, when I looked at who else from my college class was going to law school, did I decide that maybe this wasn't for me. I ended up writing a memoir with First Lady Laura Bush because I answered my phone at 6:40 on a cold Monday night in January 2009, and the high-powered lawyer on the other end, who was handling her book deal, said, "I'm about to send up the list of 30 potential writers to the publisher and Mrs. Bush tomorrow, and there isn't one name on here that Mrs. Bush will recognize. You've interviewed her, so I'd like to put your name on the list, but you have to send me a bio in the next 10 minutes. I said, okay, and I sent the bio. And I waited to be brushed off. I had done one small collaborative book when I was in my 20s. It hadn't even been published by a major New York press. Instead, I got plucked onto the finalist list because Mrs. Bush did, fortunately, recognize my name and thought I had done a pretty good job whenever I had interviewed her. 2 months later, much to the horror of the publisher, I would add, Mrs. Bush picked me, and I suddenly changed careers. I've just finished my 5th book, and this one is with that same publisher. And this time, they actually really wanted to work with me, so there's always hope. After college, I went to China and taught at a university. I did this because I felt I knew nothing about Asia, and I really wanted to learn. I happened to be there when the protests occurred at Tiananmen Square, and there were huge demonstrations in my own city of Wuhan, a small city of about 7 million people that you probably haven't heard of. That both gave me something to write about and ended up sending me to Washington, D.C., where I worked for a staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Capitol Hill. A year there taught me that I really did not like working in politics, no matter how interesting the issues. Instead, what I learned started me down the path of magazine writing. I came to understand that what I did best and what I had a feel for was helping other people share their ideas or tell their stories. I'm not going to bore you with a full-sentence version of my resume, but at times it's been a pretty winding path. And that is not a bad thing. I've learned a lot in the intervening years, and I'm hoping that you will indulge me if I share some of that this morning. For those of you getting ready to tune out right about now and wondering if you can sneak a peek at your phone, I have a middle schooler, I have a 5th grader, I know. I'm going to start by saying that what I've learned has nothing to do with writing. It applies no matter what field you are in. Although I will say that every one of you in this room needs to become a writer. Even if you are a future chemical engineer or an architect or a hedge fund manager, no one has of yet come up with a way to communicate complex and complete thoughts without words. Emoticons and acronyms only get you so far. As for equations, someone changes the math curriculum about every 5 to 10 years. I remember when it was called New Math, and that was about 5 maths ago. You can have the most amazing ideas, designs, concepts, but if you cannot find a way to verbally articulate them to your peers and also to people outside of your discipline, you will not be heard. Everyone needs words. Everyone needs to know how to use words. When you hear or read words that are used badly, that's when you know how truly important they are. So, learn how to write. It is absolutely the most valuable thing that you can get out of your education. The ability to communicate will never be obsolete. And no, the English department did not bribe me with a venti Starbucks this morning to make that pitch. It was the Alumni Relations Office. Other than that, I have 5 pieces of advice. The first one is, do not follow your passion. Anyone who tells you to follow your passion either thinks you have a very large trust fund to fall back on or is setting you up for failure. Most of the great literature you will read, under both tragedy and comedy, is about people who followed their passions. Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Tolstoy, the Dwarf King and the Hobbit, Voldemort, and Harry Potter. Consider how many times poor old Charlie Brown has humiliated himself in pursuit of the elusive little red-haired girl. Or consider those Justin Bieber posters some of you had when you were 11 or 12. Don't follow your passion. Instead, find something that you can be passionate about. Find something that you can bring your own passion to. That might be medicine, it might be teaching, it might be design, it might be something else entirely. The thing about work, all work, is that some days it is a slog. Some days you are tired, your colleagues are in a bad mood, you are looking at an endless blank page, something fails, or worse. At all of those moments, work is not going to fulfill you. But if you have that reserve of passion, if you remember what brought you to this place, you can, pardon the pun, work through it. You can do what is expected of you and then some. It's true that some people do find their passion in their work, but some also find it in the knowledge and satisfaction that they are employing other people, or they find it entirely outside of their job, in their families, their friends, their volunteer efforts. The most successful people, however, bring their passion with them. They don't expect it to be provided to them by a job, no matter how great or significant that job may be. Second, grow. Never stop growing. When I was pretty young, my editor at Parade asked me to interview Bill Gates. Back then, Bill Gates was pretty young too. He was just getting ready to launch Windows 95, which is the software program that spawned all future Windows programs. I went out to Seattle and toured around Microsoft, which in 1995 had tighter security than the Pentagon. I wasn't even able to go into the bathroom without a monitor. I spoke with lots of people there before I did my interview, and they all warned me that if Bill Gates didn't like my questions, he would yell at me and throw me out of his office. After about the third time hearing this, I thought, well, that's my bar. Don't get kicked out, and the interview will have been a success. And my second thought was, have better questions. So I spent a lot of time asking him big thought questions. Back then, he gulped down cherry Coke, and he liked to rock forward and back a lot as he talked. He pulled down books of physics lectures by Richard Feynman. He wanted to make sure that I understood that he was an engineer, a programmer, and not just a very savvy businessman. He was by far the most completely confident person I had ever met. Absolutely sure of his own infallibility, not one shred of self-doubt, and not a whole lot of self-reflection. He said that everything he had wanted to accomplish by age 40, he had done, except for having kids. And exactly 6 weeks later, Microsoft announced that his wife, Melinda, was pregnant. I was lucky enough to return to his office in December 2001. At that point, he had a couple of kids, and had been the subject of a grueling federal government Justice Department investigation. And he had really changed. He had 3 things he wanted to focus on. In 1995, he had told me that philanthropy was something he would think about when he was deep into his 60s. By 2001, he had started the Gates Foundation and instead was thinking about new ways to change education and healthcare around the world. He was not just smart, he was thoughtful. His answers had evolved and changed. He had grown. My third piece of advice is listen. Stop and really listen to the people around you, to what someone else is saying. When I started working with Mrs. Bush on her memoir, the editor had an idea of how she wanted the book to start, with an anecdote from the White House years. And it was a really good idea. But as I started listening to Mrs. Bush talk about her life in the remote West Texas of the late 40s, early 50s, 60s, and I heard her tell me about how, as a 2-year-old girl, she was brought to a tiny health clinic to see her baby brother. For those of you who don't know, Laura Bush is an only child. That baby brother was born premature. There was no preemie care where her family lived, and 2 days later, he died. Looking through that big, thick glass toward the baby who would not survive was her first solid memory, and I knew right then that that was the start of the book. Over the years, I've learned so much more from listening than from opening up my own mouth. Listen without an agenda, without preconceived notions. Listen as if you are hearing it all for the very first time. Number 4, we're getting close. Give 150%. This is easy. Whatever the project is, always do more. For books, I write jacket and galley copy, as well as the stuff between the covers. I used to cut my own articles to fit the magazine layout. Whatever the task, I tried to step up. When it comes to careers, there are some people who are grand strategists who have it all mapped out. And then there are what I like to think of as the rest of us. I've never been totally sure where I'm going to end up. I'm even not 100% sure now. But I've always tried to give 150% to whatever task is before me, believing that doing well opens its own sets of doors, believing that reputation matters. When I was asked to do First Lady Michelle Obama's White House kitchen garden book, I realized there wasn't a stylist for the photo shoots at the White House. And the photos really mattered. They mattered actually more than the text. So I volunteered. I had never been a stylist before, but I had spent a lot of time with photographers on photo shoots. I made sure all the plants in the garden were photographed each time. I lined up jars of homemade honey by density and color for their photo. I arranged for the extra tall ladder to shoot the aerial view of the garden. When a major spring photo shoot was scheduled for Memorial Day and no one from the National Park Service was there to water and weed in the garden because of the federal holiday, I watered and weeded in 96 degrees so things would look nice. When we shot the book's cover, the plan was to use vegetables as props. But the ones growing in the garden needed to be saved for the harvest with the school kids a few weeks later. It's a small space, and no one wanted to waste them. But to get vegetables into the White House, you don't just go to Whole Foods, load up your bags, and drive right in and take them out of your trunk. So I went to the local farm market of a farmer who had helped set up the garden and offered his advice. I told Jim Crawford what I needed, and I left with a rolling suitcase and 3 enormous LL Bean canvas bags of eggplants, pumpkins, okra, squash, and you name it. The next day, I met the photographer and his assistant at their hotel, and then we set out on foot. They carried their tens of thousands of dollars of photographic gear, and I pulled the suitcase of vegetables and lugged the oversized LL Bean bags along Pennsylvania Avenue, past the Treasury Department, past the White House, to the visitor's entrance, where the bags were inspected by bomb-sniffing dogs, who fortunately don't like vegetables, and then we lugged all our gear to the garden, which at least was downhill. It wasn't glamorous, it was sweaty, and my shoulders hurt for days. And in the end, the cover looked fantastic, and the vegetables more than held their own. Finally, the last piece of advice, number 5, and then I'll take some questions, because I know you guys have good ones, is the most important. All work matters. All work is valuable. I was going to tell this story before the giant snow of last weekend, where my kids are still not back in school, but it seems even better now. First, I need to tell you about my trash guys, Daniel and Oscar. They've been my trash guys for probably 15 years, since before my older son was born, and I know a little something about them. Daniel is from Mexico, Oscar is from El Salvador. As long as Oscar has been working in my neighborhood, he hasn't been home to see his family. He sends money back for his kids' education, and he lives in Danielle's basement. I know that Danielle has children, including a 15-year-old son. We talk about our kids sometimes. And that a few years ago, he was bitten by a nasty dog in our neighborhood through 3 layers of clothing, breaking his skin. Because one day he showed up at my house to get my trash early one morning, and his pant leg was bloody and torn. And I patched him up because I knew he wouldn't go to a doctor, and called our local policeman because Daniel was worried that if he complained, he would get in trouble. Both my boys, when they were little, also loved to see the trash truck, especially when Daniel blew the air horn. On March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 2014, Washington, D.C. was brought to its knees by a 7-plus-inch snow. I was in West Virginia with my boys where my older son was playing a tennis tournament. It was a 4-hour drive away under good conditions. So it was a more than 4-hour drive home. He had played 7 matches, and he was 11. He had played 7 matches and had cramped badly during his last match and could barely stand, for those of you who are tennis players or athletes. My other son was 9. All the way coming back, I saw where people had abandoned their vehicles along the roadside. And the closer I got to DC, the deeper the snow and the stronger the cold. It was about 5:15 in the afternoon after that long drive, and I was getting very nervous. I was thinking about my snowed-in driveway, my snowed-in sidewalk and walkway, and the icy crust that had now formed on top. I was wondering how I was ever going to get them shoveled in the dark and get into my house. And then I drove down my snow-covered street, which was down to a 1-lane road, and I saw something. I saw the black asphalt of my driveway and the red brick of my walk, and I saw my steps, and I saw one path that had been made around to the side spot where I keep my trash cans. Now, no one knows where I keep my trash cans. There is actually an ancient town rule that the cans be kept out of sight of the street. No one knows except for Danielle and Oscar. And in that moment, I knew that that morning they had seen my missing car, they'd seen nobody was home, and they had seen the snow. And they had actually stopped collecting everyone else's trash and had grabbed their shovels to make sure that when I came back, I could pull right in. Some days, the people who matter most are the guys who show up to get your trash. And they all have lives, and they all have stories, and they all have names. If you go to work each day remembering that everyone matters, all the rest of it is really as simple as that. Thank you. All right. I don't know whether you all want to stand up there at the mic and ask questions. I also did get a list of questions that were sent to me by the alumni office. So if you are afraid, if one of you is not brave enough to stand up and get the ball rolling, I'm happy to sort of self-ask the questions. So I'll try that. Okay. I want to be an English major, but my parents don't think I'll be able to get a job and want me to major in finance or science instead. Please help. What can I tell them? Well, you know, your major is not necessarily, unless you want to go into medicine, and even then it's not a deal breaker because you can do lots of things. Your major in school is not going to be the thing that actually is always determinative of what you're going to pursue, unless it's the very hard sciences or engineering. So I think while it's important to have something that grounds you, education is also your school years. Graduate school is what matters most, but for those types of professions. But your undergraduate years are the last chance you also have to explore something different and to take things that you cannot study independently and to challenge yourself. I'm sad at Pingree that I never took Latin with Albie Booth. That's my one regret from my whole educational experience here. I think that would have been phenomenal. And I would suggest take courses in what interests you in the department with great professors. Seek out the great professors. Make sure you study with them. Because what you really want to come out of your education with is the ability to communicate and think critically. The technical things that you learn are all going to change. I mean, I wrote my senior thesis on a very old Macintosh computer that crashed a lot and used to have a little bomb come up on the screen as it was dying. And if you hadn't saved to the floppy disk, that was it. So you have no idea. Nobody even conceived of a cell phone. A phone that you could take a picture with. We were like still in the rotary dial age, basically. I mean, the push button thing was very exciting. So what you study now is a lot of it's going to be obsolete, but the skills of being able to think critically and communicate will not. Find something where you can learn how to do that, and that will then carry you forward. I was actually telling some of the people here yesterday that the class that I have actually used the most over the course of my life thus far, and that I have retained the most from, is Barbara Berlin's AP Art History. I have used it in writing. I have used it, traveling. I have used it everywhere. That course was the most useful thing I could have taken. And I'm not sure that's what those are not usually the sentences that are associated with art history. But she taught me all about literature, about, religion, about a whole bunch of other things enveloped in the study of art and about expression. It was a phenomenal course. Okay. Many of your books are political memoirs. How do you balance your subject's desire to impart a message? Oh, you do? Oh, great. Excellent.
Thank you for coming to Pingree.
You're welcome.
So, going back to your interviews with, for example, Laura Bush and Bill Gates. So, Laura Bush liked being interviewed by you, and Bill Gates managed to keep you, you managed to be kept around by Bill Gates. So, I was just wondering, what sets you apart from other interviewers?
Well, it's kind of tricky to know because truthfully, you don't go in and it's not like you line up your competition and everybody sort of has a question off and you see how you do, especially for print. The only way you get a small sense watching TV, but that is such a different medium and the questions are different. I think that really what it is and was is that I did not go in with an agenda. I went in to listen to what they had to say, and I thought about, here I have an opportunity to sit down with these individuals and ask questions, and most people never have that opportunity. So what is it that I think would be interesting to the majority of people, and what is it that they have to say? And not necessarily the routine day-to-day questions, but questions about bigger issues or bigger picture questions, something that the question that they weren't being asked. I can remember interviewing Barry McCaffrey, who was a very top-ranking general and later became the drug czar. And I asked him a question, what was the hardest order you ever gave in the military? And he said, wow, nobody's ever asked me that before. And it actually produced a really interesting response. So I really put a lot of time into my questions and then listened to what they had to say. And I think that matters. And I'll say one other thing that is a bit of a tag-along to that what I see a lot of today and what I hear a lot of in questions is that there are two categories that have been conflated that are really very separate. One is the category of ideas, and the other is the category of opinions. Opinions are, do you like peanut butter and jelly? And ideas are, what's next for peanut butter and jelly? But people have sort of forgotten that opinions are not ideas. And if you always are asking people, what do you like? Or the question of what do you think, but really as a substitute for what do you like, you are not going to be discussing solutions or philosophy because those are both in the ideas camp. You are going to be discussing, do you like peanut butter and jelly? And I think that is what we have gotten away from, is that dichotomy. We don't ask enough about ideas, and we ask way too much about opinions.
Thank you.
Many of your books are political memoirs. How do you balance your subject's desire to impart a message with your own artistic perspective, and all of that with a desire to present the truth? Well, I think that really what it is that I try as much as possible to take myself out of the equation and not to, and to present someone's story as to hear their story and present it as they would present it. There's a little bit of difference, or there's a lot of difference sometimes between, if you're presenting it in an article format as a magazine article or something, or you're assisting someone tell their first person story in the book. I mean, you're working with someone to help them tell their story. I don't want to say it's exactly adversarial when you're working on an article, but they both need skepticism, because you have to make sure that someone telling their story is telling it, that they're getting all their facts right and their details right, and you have to keep going over it. But when you're interviewing them in a magazine format or something similar, you are trying to you're trying to play devil's advocate and follow up. And I would play devil's advocate, even if privately I agreed with the person, I would always play devil's advocate, because if you can't support what you're saying, or you can't find a way to explain it to the next level, then your idea is not that well formed. And sometimes, in fact, frequently, the meatiest part and the best part is what comes in the last 5 minutes of an interview, once you've worked through all the layers and gotten somebody down. Okay, I think you have a question since you're sitting there. Yes?
Thank you for coming today. I was wondering, have you ever had to compromise your morals or what you believe in to get ahead in your profession or to get a good story?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I actually got asked this question at another point in something similar. It was actually at a talk I did a number of years ago at the Potomac School, quite a number of years ago now, which was a prep school in outside of Washington in McLean, Virginia. And at that point, when I gave that answer, I was able to say no. And after I gave that answer, I ended up working with a few people not in books, but in the journalistic world, where I could really see everything pivot, and where if they didn't like the answer, or they didn't like what someone said, they wanted it skewed in one direction or another. And a couple of instances where I really ended up in quite a tussle over that with a couple of different editors, because I felt very uncomfortable doing that. And I think that, unfortunately, especially with the direction of journalism, that is more and more the way we're going, where people are asked to compromise or do something, or there's such intense pressure to be first, to be immediate without checking facts. And that makes me very uncomfortable. I have personally not ended up having to do that in a way that I've always fought back against it, but I see it as more and more of a larger systemic problem, and one that's not discussed enough.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for coming today.
Sure.
So I just have a question. You said that Bill Gates didn't throw you out of the interview, but has anyone you were interviewing ever done so?
No one has. I'm actually, I could really quickly, though, tell one very funny story. Right before 9/11, I was assigned to work on a profile of Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of the Pentagon. And Donald Rumsfeld, actually a lot of people thought before 9/11 he was going to be fired, because nobody was very happy with him. It's hard to remember that now. And in August of 2001, I was like, oh my gosh, I better get this thing finished, because who knows whether he's still going to be there. And then, of course, September 11th happened. And the Pentagon actually really wanted me to come back right away to finish working this, and I was in the building about 3 or 4 days after 9/11. And I mean, one thing anybody who's ever been in any of either the Twin Towers area or the Pentagon, the smell, you'll never, for the rest of your life, it's an indescribably awful smell that lasted and lasted, and that will always stick with me. But I finally got my actual interview time, and we had just started bombing in Afghanistan, U.S. forces had, and he was downstairs doing a press briefing. I was brought up with the photographer because who was going to take the cover photo, to wait in his office by the press people. And when I mean wait, we were like allowed to walk around the office. And I'm thinking, okay, this war, we either have no classified information on which we're fighting this war, or we are walking around his office in the middle of tons of classified information, and they've turned us loose. So anyway, we spent 45 minutes in his office, and they took test shots because they thought they were going to take a photo of him in his office, test shots of his desks. And then we were ushered in to wait in the secretary's dining room, and all of a sudden the doors burst open, and he is really unhappy. And because, and I'm sure that the press attaché who did this was probably stationed immediately in Nome, Alaska or something like that, like next plane out. But, he was really mad, and I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I have to interview this man. He's furious. And every minute that he spends getting mad is a minute that I'm losing in interview time, so this is really serious. So we got it straightened out. The photographer, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, had to turn over all his film and, have that destroyed. And we got through the interview. That's about as close as I've ever gotten to that. The goal really is not to get kicked out.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. All right. Do we have any more? All right, I'm going to ask another one of the self. How is interacting with the famous people you've met? Are they similar to how they are portrayed in the media, or are they different? Are there aspects of them that are totally misunderstood by the public? Well, I'm so glad you asked that question. People are people, and I will say that also a lot of famous people are really funny in private, and Michelle Obama and Laura Bush have fantastic senses of humor. I mean, I don't know, I sometimes think maybe we'd be better off to have like Jerry Seinfeld or something be a debate moderator and kind of bring out something different, because most of these people in public life, you have to have a sense of humor. But what's interesting is that you see a lot. It's the thing that's sort of overwhelming are the trappings of power, walking into the White House or Congress or being in a motorcade. And those are really heady experiences. I mean, you definitely look up and you pinch yourself and you say, oh my goodness, here I am. But they're all regular people underneath. It's just that we get a sort of altered perception of them. And if you ever see any type of celebrity, they almost in first glance, when you look at them, they seem less like people than like animations of all their two-dimensional images. And you kind of have to get beyond that pretty quickly if you're going to interact with them. But I think that there's a difference between sort of being respectful for the position that they've obtained and being starstruck. And you have to sort of go with the respect, but the respect is, especially for people in public life, the respect and the appreciation should be for the institution and for the fact of all the people who have walked through the White House, not this particular person, because it's the place more than the people. It is hard for them too. I mean, like if you're a first lady, you can never have a bad hair day. You can never go out without your makeup. People have these expectations of how to look. Even Bo, the dog, if he goes out in public, he has to be groomed first. It's very, very challenging, and I think there's sort of a burden of how we look upon them. I kind of hope that, that in the future, maybe we'll get some, like makeup-free, I don't know, first ladies, first gentlemen, whatever. Okay. Thank you all so much. I really appreciated this. Good luck.
That was awesome. Thank you, Lyric. That was great. And thanks for all the questions, both here today and that were emailed in. So with that, we're going to head off to the first session. I'd ask the students to stay seated. Speakers, there are student escorts who I think will have signs or pieces of paper with your name on it, who will take you off to your first session. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Juniors and seniors, if you arrived late, please check with Miss Peak to get your schedule so you know where you're going. There's a couple of you guys who walked in after they took down the tables. Thanks.